Hey everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. Washington's getting a lot colder. Some would even say it's shutting down, and I'm not talking about the recent blizzards. The latest issue of Time magazine examines why Washington is frozen and what this inability to compromise and pass legislation means for all of us. Joining me are Mark Halperin, Time senior political analyst and co-author of Game Change. Also from Washington, from Politico headquarters, world headquarters, Mike Allen, who's the chief political correspondent for Politico, and Bob Woodward said the most influential journalist today. Did you know that, Mike?
I didn't know that, but if Bob says it, if Katie says it, I believe it.
Well, Mark says it, so I'm not sure if we can believe it, but congratulations if in fact it's true. By the way, we're going to answer some of your questions from Facebook and Twitter, and we'd like to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Dove. Anyway, so Mark and Mike, let me ask you, the emerging narrative everywhere in the media is Washington is broken, and I guess this encapsulates what a lot of people have been writing about, why Washington is frozen. The latest issue of Time magazine, you know, all the polls basically say people are disgusted with both parties. They think bipartisanship no longer exists in any fashion, really, in the nation's capital. Before we even discuss this, I want to know, do you guys agree with that assessment?
It's on the cover of Time, so it must be true. You know, there's a paradox. Washington is frozen because the most extreme people on the left and the right exercise increasing and huge influence over what members of Congress and even the White House does. Out in the country, I think there is this mood to get things done, to demand change in Washington. The problem is people in Washington are too affected by these extreme left and right activists and media, and they're not really able, for some reason, to react and to break through that ice cube.
What do you think, Mike?
Well, and Republicans right now don't have any incentive to reach out because they know that whatever their numbers are now, in January, after the elections, in both the House and the Senate, they're going to be a lot bigger. So why should they make a deal now? They might be in charge in January. Democrats, though, have a big incentive to try to get something done, and I think we're going to see them try to do small things.
But Mike,
and that's because
I was just going to say,
Barack Obama. Yeah.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Barack Obama in particular and Democrats in general were elected on the idea that they could get things done. They could make government work. People want that, and it's not happening.
Well, do you really think that there's a lot to be gained by Republicans being obstructionists? You said they have no motive to be cooperative or to offer any kind of compromise, but isn't the mood in the country, at least indicated by recent polls, sort of a pox on both their houses? We're kind of disgusted with all of you who can't get out of the sandbox. And if they just are, in fact, if you want to listen to the Democratic rhetoric, the party of no, isn't that going to hurt them? Or are you saying maybe these conservative activists who are demanding a very different way of doing business will come out in the polls in the midterm elections and then put more of them in power?
No, I think that's a very astute point about the mood of the country. And you see the party of no as a very damaging label for them. So just this week, House Republican leaders wrote to Democratic leaders and say, hey, we're having that summit about health care next week. Why don't we also have a debate about jobs, just Democratic and Republican congressional leaders? Now, we're told today that the Democratic leaders have not ruled that idea in or out, but I think it shows that Republicans are worried about exactly the point you just made.
Do you think that anything we might be seeing a soupçon mark of change as a result of, I mean, these people on Capitol Hill, they read the polls. They understand that people are kind of disgusted with the way things are working in Washington. When we hear about this healthcare summit, of course, there was so much hand-wringing. Should the Republicans even come? Are the Democrats even open? Is the president just kind of going to dig his heels in? But do you think through some of these initiatives, the ones that Mike just described, we're seeing any movement towards bipartisanship at all?
No real movement, because the Republicans have almost no incentive to cooperate unless the president can convince them that it is in the country's interest that they cooperate, and the country demands it because we have an economic crisis and we're at war and all the other big problems.
Isn't the country demanding it?
The country, as I said at the beginning, the country is. The problem is, there's this convention in Washington, the CPAC convention of the conservative activists. There's nobody there saying, you know what, for the good of the country, let's cooperate.
Well, other than polls, how can these people get the message that there are a lot of massive problems and we need to come up with some solutions and some compromises and some movement?
What they think is that the solutions that would occur if Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama play a big part in the solutions are solutions that the country doesn't want, that they're too left-wing. Look, politicians look at the data. They do see those polls, but the other data they see Mike referred to. Since January, every time the Republicans have said no, they've moved up in the polls, and Obama and the Democrats have moved down. They, in some ways, would be irrational to cooperate and let things get done, because that would play into a different narrative, a narrative that says Barack Obama is an effective president. The best thing they have going for them right now is that Barack Obama is looking increasingly to Americans like a president who's failing, and that will help them in November. The only thing I think will appeal to them is not they're afraid of the polls, the country wants to get things done. Obama, I believe, has to go to them and say, you know what, we're going to have to put politics aside because there's a crisis and I'm going to meet you halfway. If he doesn't do that, I don't think anything will get done.
Mike, do you think he will do that?
There are no signs that he will, but Katie, I think that if any politician in America had the possibility of succeeding there, it would be Barack Obama, with his unique personal hold on the country, with his unique personal and communication skills. I saw Invictus, the Nelson Mandela movie, the other day. And there's a scene in there where when he's moving into his office as South Africa's first black president, he says to all the white workers who are packing up their stuff, he said, don't leave on my account. Like, if you want to stay here and work, you can. Maybe the president needs some dramatic overture to the other side. That's what people elected him for. And a big danger for President Obama coming up is disappointment. That people thought that he could solve a problem that honestly may be insoluble.
I didn't know we were supposed to come armed with movie metaphors. I've messed up.
Hey, well, did you think there was something up in the air that you might be applicable here?
I think Barack Obama's being sarcastic like the Ed Asner character, and that's a bad idea. I don't think sarcasm plays well in a president, and I think he's turned off a lot of Republicans. Asner's sarcasm worked in the film, I felt,
Katie,
with that little boy.
Katie, one of the,
Go ahead, Mike.
Katie, one of the most interesting ideas in this Peter Beinart cover story in Time magazine is that Republicans get elected by discrediting government, by making fun of government. If there's a third-party candidate, someone from outside this system who's going to come forward and the conditions for it, I think you guys will agree, are the best they've been in decades. What about a candidate who can get people to, rather than pulling government back, be elected on demand that Washington get things done? If you could get a candidate whose mandate was to get things done, to overcome this gridlock, we might have a different picture.
As soon as donkeys fly, that will happen.
Yeah, really? You think there's nobody?
The problem is there is nobody. Mike's right about the conditions. If, as I say, if General Powell were 25 years younger, half as sane as Ross Perot, and had all of Michael Bloomberg's money, he could do it. But he's not.
General Powell, who's going to be on CBS's Face the Nation this weekend, by the way.
I was trying to segue into a promo, thank you. There's just nobody out there who has, you got to be a multi-millionaire, not just like the kind of people you'd go to a dinner party with in Manhattan, but like a really rich person, like tens and hundreds of millions, maybe billions. There's just nobody like that out there who is showing any signs of having political aspirations. This country, this political system is not hospitable, even now, to a third-party candidate.
Well, it's very depressing what I'm hearing you guys say, though. You know, you're saying that there's no motivation for the Republicans to cooperate because it's not going to help them at the polls,
It'll
right?
happen in January.
You know, so...
No, but Katie, you should be hopeful from what we're all agreeing on, which is that there is a market for it in the country. There is a demand for it. You look in the research and it's clear. And when there is that clear demand for something, and you pointed out, can't these guys read poll numbers? When the public wants something that clearly, eventually somebody's going to respond to that call.
Just may not be until after Republicans control the Congress, which they may well come January. That could be the only thing that can save Barack Obama, ironically, is losing control of Congress to the other party. Just as Bill Clinton
effect.
It worked for Bill Clinton. A lot of the compromises he'd like to make, he is not a big liberal the way the Republicans say. A lot of the things he'd like to do, he can't do because he's turned over too much of his presidency to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and these liberal committee chairs on the Democratic side. If Republicans are in charge, I think he can cooperate and he'd be more of a centrist.
Yeah, Katie, you know what's interesting, and the White House denies it, but Democrats in both the House and Senate are very worried that exactly because of the effect that Mark's pointing to, that President Obama, his top advisors, they might not really mind having a Republican House or a Republican Senate, that the idea of having a foil might be effective. And so they're worried that President Obama, in the campaign stretch coming up, and certainly after that, will be running against Congress. The Congress will be thrown under the bus to make the points about the kind of leadership that he'd like to deliver separately from the Democrats on the Hill.
Like that scene in Inglourious Bastards.
Let's talk about Evan Bayh, because he's just the latest politician who has said, I've had it, nothing, Congress isn't working. Actually, I don't need to paraphrase him. We have a soundbite poll. This is a very highly produced program. So let's take a look at what Senator Bayh had to say.
For some time, I've had a growing conviction that Congress is not operating as it should. There is much too much partisanship and not enough progress. Too much narrow ideology and not enough practical problem solving. Even at a time of enormous national challenge, the people's business is not getting done.
So what needs to happen to get the people's business done? I mean, are there any solutions? You guys are talking about maybe the House should, become a Republican majority and all that. But what, people who don't follow this day in and day out, are there any things that can be done that break the terrible gridlock and the paralysis that we see in the nation's capital?
Well, what do you guys think of this approach? That President Obama call the Republicans in, turn on CBS's cameras, C-SPAN's cameras, and say, what would you do? And from there, rather than try to attack these problems in the gigantic, momentous, expensive ways that he has been, do chewable bites. You can sit down with the Republicans, you can go to the Chamber of Commerce, and they will give you pieces of a health care plan, pieces of a Wall Street regulatory plan, pieces of an energy plan that they'll agree with. Try and do a few pieces rather than trying to eat the whole sandwich at once.
Incremental changes. So,
Right.
Well, will there be hell to pay from his base if he does this, Mark?
Yes, his base is
But now
still
he's
trying
got
to.
nothing instead.
His base is still trying to pass a public option, which does not have the votes to
That's
pass.
so laughable. I saw that.
This,
Can you believe it?
this is the moment when he should do what he should have done months ago, which is exactly what Mike said. Call on the Republicans and do smaller things. The fact is, the president could probably get 70% of what he wants on energy and health care and on a stimulus bill by cooperating with Republicans. But the Democrats won't give up 30% in Congress. He needs to make it happen. In terms of people out in the country, they should vote for people like Evan Bayh, who are not afraid to work across the aisle. I would say to Evan Bayh, though, good analysis of what's wrong. Why leave? He's one of the few people in the Congress who will work with people from the other party. I'm mystified that having diagnosed the problem the way he did, he's walking away.
Are you mystified as well, Mike?
I agree totally. And there's a lot of buzz online about, oh, thank you, Evan Bayh. You don't like those mean Republicans, so you're going to teach them by making Mitch McConnell the majority leader, something that is now much more likely with Indiana in danger. I think that we have to acknowledge here that a clear factor in Senator Bayh's decision, he probably would have won. He has $13 million. He would have won, but it would have been a very tough race in a horrible environment. It's possible he would be in the minority. He knows he's not going to be president now, and I just think he didn't want that race, and that's at least some percentage of the decision.
I think he was afraid of losing, even though he's ahead and he's got a lot of money.
He also said he had the heart of an executive. Do you think it's a precursor to a presidential run? I know there's been some conversations about that.
I asked him the other morning on a cable television program if he would rule out running in 2012 as a Democrat or an independent. He absolutely ruled it out. He was a presidential candidate for about 25 minutes in 2008,
right,
and it didn't go that well. He'd like to be president. I think he might well run for governor of Indiana and run for president down the road. Despite the fact that he has the mannerisms of an 85-year-old, he's still a pretty young guy. Isn't
part of the problem, Mike, what you guys alluded to earlier, that, you say that all these politicians are beholden to the fringe elements of their party, but in this Time magazine article, it's also discussed that there are really very few moderates now. You used to hear about conservative Democrats like Sam Nunn on Capitol Hill or moderate Republicans. I mean, are those few and far between these days? Is that part of the problem? Everybody is so sort of marginalized?
That is a great point, and a big part of it is because of the way the districts are drawn in this country, especially in the House, that because we have computer programs now where parties can maximize their concentration of voters, get all the Republicans in one district or all the Democrats in one district, that you tend to have, rather than a lot of sort of squishy people like the country is. It's a 40-40 country, 50-50 country, whatever you want to call it. But that's not how our leaders are, and it's because they tend to come from either very Democratic districts or very Republican districts. They go home at night, they go home on the weekends. They don't socialize the way Washington used to hear about the House Speaker, the big liberal Democrat, Tip O'Neill, like having a drink with Republicans. That just doesn't happen. And this is another place that President Obama could set the tone. Katie, when you sat down with President Obama at the Super Bowl, you pointed out that his Super Bowl party was mostly Democrats. That was a lost opportunity for him.
What do you think about the filibuster? You know, there have been conversations. I guess the Republicans have filibustered 80% of Democratic legislation. Isn't that right? I think it was written in time in 2009. Yeah. And there have been conversations about, should we just get rid of the filibuster, or should we make them actually filibuster something? In other words, stand there ad infinitum and you know, do what Strom Thurmond did when he stood at the well of the Senate for what did he, 24 hours straight or something insane like that? Well, I mean, is there something wrong with the system that
I think if
the threat of the filibuster can mean nothing will happen?
There's some Senate rules that are a bit silly, but I think if the president were proposing things that were really, really popular in the country, the Republicans would pay a political price if they tried to block them through the filibuster. That's what's broken, I continue to believe, is that the president just got too locked in with the liberals in Congress and his party. And the reason Republicans get away largely with being the party of no, often exercised through the filibuster, is because the country says, yeah, you're doing this to stop Obamacare? Fine.
Why did President Obama go down this path, you think, Mike? Well, you know, he did run sort of on this whole idea of bipartisanship and getting rid of sort of the toxic environment in Washington. Why was he so quick to relinquish so much power to the Democratic Politico, sorry for the use of that word, on Capitol Hill, Mike?
Yeah, well, Katie, I think he had advice from a lot of people. He'd been in the Senate himself. He had advice from a lot of people whose experience were largely shaped by the Capitol Hill. And so he maybe deferred more to them than he needed to. But now he and his party are paying a terrible price. Somebody very close to the president told me that they think that going into November, that an even bigger problem than joblessness, something that's more dangerous to Democrats than 8 or 9% unemployment, is this toxic attitude in the country toward Washington. And Katie, usually I try to be Mr. Sunshine, but now I'm going to tell you something that's going to make you even more depressed.
Thanks, Mike. Wait, Prozac, anyone? Okay, go ahead.
That is every indication we have that the Democratic strategy for the spring is to amp up the partisanship, to make it clear we're on the side of the working class. We're on the side of middle class families, not Republicans. They're on the side of insurance companies, of banks, of for-profit student lenders. We're going to see that both on the Hill, where there's going to be a lot of symbolic votes, allowing Democrats to stand with working families. And we're going to see the president in his travel around the country saying, I'm on the side of the middle working class. Republicans, are you going to stand with insurers and these other big businesses?
Is that going to be effective, you think, Mark?
It might be effective in terms of amping up the hostility between the parties, if that's their goal. But
Mark, be fair, that's not their goal. But it also.
But look, one of them. I was being sarcastic, just like the president. One of the most admirable things about Barack Obama is he ran to be president to change the country in ways he thinks are a good idea, not to keep winning elections. One of the failures of George Bush was he turned too much power over to his party in Congress, and their whole orientation was keeping and extending their majority. If Barack Obama wants to get things done in the second year of his presidency, that is not a good strategy, because I don't think they have the votes to pass anything that way, and it'll further alienate the Republicans.
And do you think it'll further alienate the country?
Yeah, well, the country's pretty alienated from this kind of stuff already, so I'm not sure how much further that can go, because the poll numbers we've been talking about, it will appease his liberal base, but I don't think appeasing his liberal base is the path to success to achieve what he wants to achieve. It might help them in the midterms some. But again, I think the best thing that could happen to him is probably to do poorly in the midterms and have Republicans to work with in Congress.
And what do you think, just getting back to the filibuster, Mike, do you think that that's here to stay? There's nothing that can be done about it, and it's sort of... go ahead.
Yeah, no, it certainly can be changed, and President Bush did a lot of his programs with 50 votes. The Senate has changed its rules, though, that makes this much easier. You don't have to go in and read the phone book anymore, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Now you just need 2 senators from the opposing party there. I'm told that there's 2 to keep the other one awake so that in case that there's a vote, they can object. So Senate rules have made it much easier. It would be possible for the Senate to change that. And there is a big push among Democrats for that. You poke around on the liberal blogs, and this is a huge issue. And somebody who went out there and talked about it a lot, I can tell you, A, they would raise a fortune, but B, they would have a lot of support.
What do you guys think of the Tea Party movement in general? You know, it's really now getting a lot of media attention. And it's been brewing, if you will, for some time now. How powerful, see Mike like that. How powerful do you think this group is? Or do you think now sort of the media is playing catch up when it comes to sort of this feeling that they have encapsulated?
I think the sentiment they express is one that has got a lot of energy. I think they're exactly analogous to Sarah Palin, who's one of their big heroines. They're the most powerful force within the party today, and they will never govern the country. So they create a distortion. They get a lot of attention, just like Sarah Palin. They're very loud and showy like Sarah Palin, but they aren't specific, and they are a danger to the Republican Party because there's a ceiling on how many people will follow them.
And in fact, Mike, a lot of sort of Republicans, whether it's John McCain or Charlie Crist, are being challenged from the right by people who really embody the Tea Party philosophy, right?
No, that's a great point. J.D. Hayworth, the former and current, once again, radio talk show host in Arizona, who's challenging Senator McCain. And that's turning into a real brawl where you have talk show hosts across the country who are taking sides in this. Almost all of them have sided with J.D. Hayworth, and Bill Bennett, I think, has endorsed Senator McCain. But I think it's very instructive, Katie, that both parties are treating the Tea Parties carefully. Once Democrats wanted to isolate or make fun of the Tea Party, but David Axelrod now says that we need to acknowledge their anger. So that's a clear sign to me of how much, how worried Democrats are about this sort of mood and its possible contagion effect. Republicans, you have the Republican National Chairman, Michael Steele, meeting this week with Tea Parties, trying to convince them, hey, come along with us, because of course they would love to have Tea Party mailing lists to raise money from the Tea Parties, which they haven't been able to because it is by definition a disaggregated group. Anybody who claims to be the leader of the Tea Parties is a charlatan. It's a bunch of little groups.
But don't Democrats sort of hope the Tea Party movement will make itself even more known in the midterm elections because it'll basically siphon off a lot of support from some Republican candidates and divide voters?
Well, they certainly hope their Tea Party candidates on the general election ballot, like in Nevada against Harry Reid. If that happens, the Democrats will win because they'll clearly draw most of their votes away from the Republican nominees. Right now, the Tea Party basically stands for two things. They stand for anger against Washington, which, as Mike said, is a huge issue that the White House and the Democrats have to worry about. And they stand for smaller government. Well, I don't know anybody who's not for smaller government in the abstract. They're not at all specific about it. Yeah.
There's a lot.
In the abstract, people are for smaller government. They may also be for some big programs, but so are the Republicans. They're for big programs. I think that in the end, the Tea Party movement could very well help them in the midterms because their lower turnout help the Republicans. But this is a movement that stands for almost nothing. And over the long term, it's allowing the Republicans to see a mirage, that this is the path back to majority status in the long term. And it's not, because they don't stand for anything specific. And they're not, I respect their public activism and they're wanting to change the country, but they're not specific enough or organized enough, I think, to be a governing movement.
Do you agree, Mike?
Yep. If the establishment, I always agree with Mark, but to add to his point, if the establishment Republicans would reach out to the Tea Parties, continue to, they're also having state Republican meetings with Tea Parties as they did the national meeting. If they could reach out to them, if the establishment could embrace some of their issues, this would be a very powerful force, because in midterm elections, you don't typically have hugely motivated groups of voters. This year you're going to, but this would be a big group that if Republicans could have them working for them rather than hurting their image, that's the way to gain majorities.
Mike, you say some of their issues. What issue do they have except they're for smaller government?
They don't like the fact that establishment Republicans are focused on issues besides the ones that you mentioned.
I only mentioned one. All I can tell that they really care about is smaller government. Some of them care about other issues, but as a movement, what do they stand for? You say if Republicans can co-opt their issues.
Right.
What are their issues?
No, but Mark, I agree with the point you made earlier that the establishment Republican Party has not been for small government. I think that they recognize that that's a problem.
But other than small government, I think Mark is asking, Mike, what would you say characterizes sort of the political philosophy of the Tea Party movement, other than we really don't like Washington and we don't think government is the answer to any of our problems?
No, I agree that that's the strain that unifies these various blends, if you will.
Do you think they're going to have to become more specific, Mike? Obviously, Mark does, but do you think they have the capability to be more specific in terms of plans? I interviewed a couple of Tea Partiers, and they said they do have some specific proposals. I just think they're not necessarily uniform throughout the movement.
Well, and the way to do that is to support specific candidates, and that's how you move ahead in this political system. They can put out all as big a platform as they want, but until they have candidates who can work with Republican parties and have a chance to build a majority in a district or a state, they're just going to cause problems. They're just going to fractionalize Republican votes and elect Democrats.
You know, Marco Rubio, you wrote about him in today's playbook, Mike, and he, I guess, gave a big Tea Party speech on Thursday, his highest profile speaking engagement yet, you called it. And he basically said, Americans want leaders who will come to Washington, D.C. and stand up to the big government agenda, not be corrupted by it. After all, the U.S. Senate already has one Arlen Specter. And basically, he says the political class tries to make sense of this, but they can't, because never has the political class nor the mainstream media that covers them been more out of touch. What does that mean exactly? America wants leaders who will come to Washington and stand up to the big government agenda, not be corrupted by it. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's an applause line that I don't think you can parse too much. Marco Rubio was speaking to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which had to move to a new hotel this year because it got so many people, 10,000 people, reflecting the sort of emboldened status of Republicans right now.
What do you think it means?
It means that the guy's smart enough to spew out a soundbite to get people to applaud. Someone should ask Marco Rubio, along with everyone else speaking at the conference, you know what, you're right, big government, not the answer to our problems. What would you like to cut? Because they don't have answers. All they have is the ability to capitalize on criticizing what President Obama has opened the door to, which is that the people in Washington now are out of touch and support big government. We're
going to do a lightning round of Twitter questions real quick, but I wanted to ask you both, what role do you think an increasingly partisan media have played in sort of the polarization of the country? And do you think in some ways they're creating this atmosphere where that makes it very sort of inhospitable to compromise?
100%.
You know,
Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
No, it depends what media you consume. If you're consuming CBS News, if you're watching the CBS Evening News, if you're watching Time Magazine, if you're reading Politico, we're not more partisan than we've ever been.
But I guess I'm talking about other outlets that are really
outlets.
advocacy journalism that seems to me that a lot of people gravitate toward media that will reflect their own views back at them and don't necessarily hear the other side. And if that's kind of ginning up this feeling of rancor in the country.
It is 100%. It's worse and worse every year. You know, Huffington Post on the left, Fox News on the right, plays to a base on either side that it gets emotionally ginned up. And it sends this message to people in office. If I cross my base, I'm going to hear from people who are angry and who I need to get reelected. It's a big problem because we're all for free speech. No one's going to stop the internet or cable TV or talk radio. But it puts extraordinary practical and psychological pressure on people in both parties, and it keeps them from compromising. I put it as a day-to-day drumbeat. I put it as high on the list as anything else, keeping compromise from taking place.
But Mike, you don't agree?
I agree that with the profusion of media choices we have, that it is much easier for now for people to get the warm bath, to hear what they want to hear, to only hear their side of the argument. Just the one reality check that I would add to that is a lot more people watch the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric than consume all those outlets that Mark added put together.
Yeah, but maybe they're sort of the silent majority who really, you know, the great sort of unwashed that we discussed earlier, who want compromise, but they're not so much on the fringes that they're making all the noise. And isn't that part of the problem?
Right. Yeah,
I'm just saying, I don't know.
I think that's a great point. Yeah,
All right.
I agree with that. It's not, It's not that it's not a problem. It's that the people who want to get information elsewhere, there's plenty of other places.
Okay, let's do this Twitter lightning round because we got some good Twitter questions. One is Bo Pook writes, I feel one term in Congress should be the limit, allowing work done for the people and not self-interest. Anyone agree? It'd be pretty tough to get much done in 2 years, wouldn't it?
It would, and there's
Yeah,
lots
you
of...
wouldn't have people.
Go ahead, Mike. Go.
Go, Mike.
No, excuse me. I was just going to say, you wouldn't have people who are knowledgeable about how to make government work.
Yeah, it seems like they would get oriented and then they'd be out of there.
Time to go. You know, you hear more talk about term limits now, just like you did back in the 90s when Ross Perot was around, because of these, particularly with big deficits and frustration with Washington. The problem is the only way to have that at the federal level is with a constitutional amendment. And in a polarized time, passing a constitutional amendment would be, I think, next to impossible on any topic.
Okay. Solify writes, we have a cancer eating the infrastructure of this great nation and we must eradicate it, starting with lobbyists and corporations. Parenthetically, 8 in 10 Americans opposed the SCOTUS decision to allow unions and corporations to spend money on behalf of candidates. I think that just came out in a Washington Post ABC News poll. So how big I mean, it seems to me that is another sort of unifying feature of the Tea Party movement, which maybe we should give them more credit for, and that is the incredible influence of lobbyists, special interests, and corporate corporations on the political process.
And that's one of those issues that does unite left and right at the sort of populist grassroots level. Barack Obama has done some things on those issues. I think there probably is a public appetite for him to do more. I'd like to hear someone associated with the Republican Party talk with specificity about what they'd like to do to reduce the influence of special interests in Washington.
Mike?
But Katie, picking up on that poll that you mentioned, we're told the leaders in Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate plan to make very high-profile runs at legislation in the next few months that would curtail the scope of that Citizens United ruling. The Senate wants to get something done before Easter as one of their key legislative accomplishments going into the midterms. So that shows how much their expectations have been dialed back.
But can they really do that? Because you mean sort of preempt the Supreme Court decision and come up with legislation that would override it?
That's what both the House and the Senate are going to try to do. I agree with you. It poses a lot of legal scholarship problems, but they are going to try. And they're at least, even in trying, it gives them the chance to say, we're with the middle class people, we're not with the corporation. There's
a lot they can do to rein back the impact of the decision, even without overturning it.
Okay. The Loop 24, I think we actually addressed this, you guys, but writes his one-line fix. Honest media reporting. What do you think?
That's why you should watch the CBS Evening News. That's why you should read Time Magazine. That's why you should read Politico. There is a lot of honest media reporting. You just have to tune out the noise, which certainly exists and certainly is getting louder and available in more places.
You agree?
Amen.
Okay. Carolyn on Facebook writes, it would be easy to ask, why can't we all get along? But my question is, when are they going to stop competing with one another and get down to business at hand and do the jobs that we hired them to do?
Really, again, liberals get mad when I say it's up to the president, but the fact is the buck stops with the president. I said the same thing about George Bush. He cannot take no for an answer from the Republicans. He must learn what it will take, what compromise will be required to get them to work together, or I don't see how he passes anything significant this year.
But let me ask you something. I mean, earlier you said, Mark, that they have no incentive, right? So the more they say no, the more power they're going to get.
They have no political incentive. I think he has to appeal to their patriotism. He has to say, you're going to have to set aside your... You know, you talk about being sunny and optimistic. What could be more hopeful about the country than to think that people who enter political life can have their sense of patriotism appealed to successfully by a president who's facing huge unemployment, 2 wars, lots of huge challenges for the country. He cannot appeal to them successfully on politics. It's impossible. He must convince them to do it for patriotic reasons.
But Mike, if the president reaches out to Republicans, isn't there a good chance, so if they want to be obstructionists, that they'll paint anything that he's trying to do, they may twist it and say this is a terrible idea. For example, Eric Cantor, I don't know, I haven't seen it yet, so maybe we can roll it. He just did a video on YouTube about the stimulus package. Mike, I think you mentioned this on Playbook this morning as well. Can we just take a quick look at this? Because this, to me, is part of the problem.
22,000. That's the number of Americans who have lost their jobs since President Obama took office. With unemployment recently reaching the highest level in 26 years, it's time to take a closer look at the Democrats' economic stimulus plan.
If nothing is done, this recession could linger for years. The unemployment rate could reach double digits.
January, 7.6% unemployment. On January 10th, the White House promised Americans that if we passed the Democrat stimulus plan, unemployment would not exceed 8%.
Now, most of the money that we're investing as part of this plan will get out the door immediately, generating or saving 3 to 4 million new jobs.
Absent this bill, our unemployment rate would grow, more people would be out of work. So the impact is immediate.
February, 8.1% unemployment, 726,000
Talk over as
total
people
jobs
continue to
lost.
watch
This bill
this.
will
But
create
does
2.5
Eric Cantor have a
million
point,
jobs
or
expected for
is
what
this
it
kind
does.
of going too far? What do you guys think of this?
I'm too afraid to say that Barack Obama seems like a scary guy. The Republican mindset now, which is to have no interest in engaging in dialogue with the president about how to fix things, but simply to try to basically say 2 more years of Democratic control of Congress and Barack Obama will produce more joblessness.
Well, why wouldn't they continue that mantra, even if he does reach out to the Republicans, Mark?
I'll say again, they will if they're politically smart and they don't care about trying to help the country. But he has to take a step and basically say, I'm no longer going to be guided by Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi. I'm going to be guided by a majority in the center. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only hope because continuing to fight back against stuff like that will just produce more gridlock, and you can put that ice cube inside a giant vault.
What did you think, Mike?
Control.
What did you think, Mike, about that Eric Cantor YouTube spot?
Yeah, well, I love the haunted house music. That's really helpful to the dialogue, and they make a point in there that's going to be a big part of their November strategy, and that is they talk about what's a result of the unified rule of House, Senate, and White House. So they're going to be arguing out in the states, Republicans can be a check on the president, put us in charge of the House. But just to pick up on a point that Mark made, I think it's great to appeal to their patriotism, but I think you can also appeal to their self-interest. Because, Katie, I'm going to agree with a point you were making earlier, that there's this huge number of people in the country who, when they're polled, they say that they want government to work together. So you can argue that it's in the politicians' longer-term interest to respond to such a clear demand, even from the electorate.
The emerging theme for the Republicans in the November midterms is Obama is a failure. You hear that, and you heard that today from Mitt Romney at the CPAC convention, one of the 2 or 3 leading Republican presidential candidates. You can hear it from conservative columnists across the board. Failure. Democrats are failing in leading the country. Cooperating with them, again, from a political point of view, would give them a success. If they work with him on education, which is the most promising area for the 2 parties to work together right now, and the president has a big bill signing where he says, I helped fix education in America, that will cut against their theme of failure. And so, again, it's very difficult to see how you motivate them on political grounds to cooperate.
Can we do a quick reality check very quickly about the stimulus package? Because I've read so many different things, and when you go to publications like Time and Newsweek, they'll say that most economists, even conservative ones, will say it did prevent things from getting much worse. And maybe, as Eric Cantor sort of insists, that there were some overpromises made in the process. But all in all, was the stimulus package a success, a failure, or a wash? Mike?
It was a success in that it saved or created at least 2 million jobs. I think one place where you clearly saw its effects was with state governments. Right. There are many state governments that would have had to furlough workers if it weren't for the stimulus package. But it did not do nearly what was promised, and it did not do nearly what you could have done with that amount of money applied in different ways.
Agreed? I
agree with that, except I'd give them a little bit more credit in the sense it was part of a comprehensive and imperfect plan that is Obama's greatest achievement to date, which is keeping the worldwide economy from slipping into a depression through the stimulus and other actions he took early on in his administration.
Right. There's no question about that. And after that, it makes any quarreling about the stats look like an asterisk. I certainly agree with that.
Jeffrey Link on Facebook writes, why can't politicians be held to the same standards as any employee of any corporation? It's easy to say the power of the voting booth works, but it doesn't. How about performance appraisals for all elected officials?
I'm for that, but I think those are called elections.
I don't know why he says the voting booth doesn't work. I can't fire someone that works for me every 2 years in the House, you have that opportunity.
And finally, the last question, Kim from Facebook. What will it take to get Washington moving again? Both of you can weigh in. And Mark, maybe think of something else besides the president has to reach out to Republicans. There must be other things, too. Newt Gingrich kind of did a whole essay about that, right?
I think this year it would require a few Republican leaders, not rank and file, because I think it'll take some leaders, to say, you know what, the jobless situation really is a problem, or education. And I think, we talk about this in kind of abstract terms. I think there's a human element to this. Let's say they work together in education. And again, there are signs this week that are pretty promising that they will. You start to work with someone, you start to figure out you do have common interests, common goals, common sense that the country has a lot of immediate challenges. Maybe build on education and do joblessness, then maybe do health care. So I think one thing that could work is just getting those muscles working again, that sense of trust on a few issues like education, where there really are agreement now that are manifest and not hidden by all this partisan yelling.
Because, Mike, people have to have their faith restored in government institutions, don't they? And so that seems to be sort of the top of the agenda right now.
No, Katie, I think that's a great point. And the two sides could surprise each other. Republicans are daring Democratic leaders to come and have a debate with them about jobs. Democrats should say, sure, we accept. Let's come talk about it. Democrats are daring Republicans to vote for specific elements of the health care bill, popular parts of the health care bill that can be passed a la carte or cherry picked. Republicans should say, yes, we are going to do that. I think they get a lot of credit for that from voters who are so far just only articulating this as anger at Washington, but need to be clearer about the idea that this is a demand for specific action.
And very quickly before we leave, I just have this crazy question. You were saying how Mitt Romney at CPAC was saying Barack Obama's a failure. That's what kind of the rhetoric we're going to be hearing between now and November. What if a Republican said, you know what? I want to get things done. I don't want to, trash the other side. I want to reach out to them. I really want to accomplish things because I know Americans are tired of business as usual. Help me help you, to quote Jerry Maguire, another movie. Yeah. Would that person be laughed out of the room?
They'd be ostracized within the party, and if they did more than just said it, but actually took concrete steps to do it, they would face a lot of pressure from within the conservative movement to stop it. I'd love if somebody did that, but they would be fighting. Even the more moderate members of the Republican Party, Olympia Snowe, for instance, Senator from Maine, you just don't hear them speak out very much that way at all. Even paying lip service to it because of so much pressure within the party.
But
Same on the other side.
Don't they have to start if this great mass of people in this country is saying we can't stand the way business is done?
They're not hearing from the mass of people. They're hearing from the angry left and the angry right.
Well, so should everybody who's a normal person is not that angry but just is frustrated? Should they just write their senators and congressmen?
And they should go to town meetings and they should vote for people in the midterms who they think will get things done.
Mike?
And this primary process, especially with Republicans, it applies to right now, is a big problem. Ironically, Mitt Romney had sort of tried what Mark is talking about. Last year, Mitt Romney praised President Obama for talking about health care, for putting a focus on health care. Mitt Romney, who was the head of the Salt Lake Winter Olympics back in 2002, he praised the president for making efforts to get Olympics. So he was trying to show that he was not reflexively against everything that Barack Obama did. But it sounds like that didn't test, or that's not the direction they're going now.
All right. Well, Mike Allen and Mark Halperin, it's always fun talking to you, both so well-informed and smart and perceptive. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Mike, nice to talk to you from Washington. Mark, thanks for coming in.
Katie.
Really appreciate it.
It was a treat. Thank you, Katie.
Okay.
See you, Mark.
See you guys. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter. It's just at Katie Couric. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.